Thank you very much, Jim. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's a great pleasure to be here at this very beautiful central location in Athens. So as Jim just said, I'm going to talk about Theosophy and Orientalism. And Orientalism, of course, entails scholars who studied Asian religions and philosophies, especially in the 19th century in this case. And often Orientalism is connected with this notion of imperialism as well, that scholarship and imperialism somehow went hand in hand. But today Buddhism, of course, is a very well-known religion. Of course, it's still becoming more and more known, but it hasn't always been the case. And in the 19th century, not much was actually known about Buddhism. The 20th century became the big century for the discovery of Buddhism. But already back in the 19th century, among the early philosophers, philosophy became very associated with Buddhism. So among scholars and also in the more among the greater public, often philosophy and Buddhism was actually linked together, almost synonymously associated. And the philosophers, they promoted this concept of an esoteric Buddhism. And all the scholars at the time said that no, esoteric Buddhism doesn't exist at all. And all the way down to our own time, ever since, there's been this notion that the philosophers, they distorted their reception of Buddhism. What they actually conceived and the way they expressed Buddhism was more or less a distortion of Buddhism, not really had nothing to do really with Buddhism. What I would like to do today is try to go back in time and take a fresh look at what the scholars at the time said and what the philosophers said, and see if maybe the picture could be revised. Maybe there's a more complex story to be found there. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First I will tell you about my basic argument in this paper. Then we'll take a look at the background, the reception of Buddhism in the 19th century, and then what did the philosophers actually mean by an esoteric Buddhism? What did that entail? And there emerged a debate following that among scholars, Orientalists, so to speak. And then we will round off with some conclusions. And this talk is based on an article I've already written. So it's going to be published by Oxford University Press as a part of an anthology, Imagining the East. So you can always ask me for more details about references and so forth.
What university press? Oxford.
Oxford, yeah. So basically, as I said, I think that if we use historical scholarship to go back in time and revise what the scholars and the philosophers said at the time about Buddhism, a different picture will emerge. So in a way it's an attempt to recontextualize. That's part of that if we actually recontextualize what took place, a new perspective on the reception of Buddhism in the West will emerge. And secondly, I want to take a look at what Blavatsky and Sinnett actually meant by esoteric Buddhism and how that relates to the historical context at the time, what other scholars of Buddhism said about Buddhism at the time and how it relates to that. And again, I think we can actually talk about two receptions of Buddhism that took place in the West at the time. That's my argument, that the philosophers, they were part of a reception of Mahayana Buddhism, where the Orientalists, they didn't like Mahayana, they didn't know much about it, and they saw it as a later kind of corruption of Buddhism, so it was not worthy of any study, basically. So the philosophers and the Orientalists, they actually were interested in two different forms of Buddhism at the time, and that's part of the complex picture. But let's first take a brief look at the reception of Buddhism in the West. First of all, as many of you, of course, know, Buddhism, similar to Hinduism, is not really, it's a construction, it's an Orientalist construction. There is not really such a thing as Buddhism or Hinduism. What does that mean? It means that before the imperial period, before Western went to Asia, to India, the Buddhists didn't really call themselves Buddhists as such. There was the Dharma, for example. There were many other concepts about the wisdom they were practicing. But to kind of put it all together in one box and say that all these traditions throughout Asia, they are Buddhists. That's kind of a part of a construction of Buddhism to make it into a world religion in a way. The same happened to Hinduism. It's the Western concepts about a lot of different traditions in Asia. Secondly, when scholars in the West became interested in Asian religions and philosophies, especially at the end of the 18th century, with the Asiatic researchers, William Jones and so forth, Buddhism was not the central attraction. The central attraction was the Vedas and ancient Sanskrit literature and so forth. That was the first major interest. But of course there were discussions about Buddhism because Buddha was mentioned throughout a lot of Asian texts, and there was this notion that there was maybe some tradition that related to this figure, the Buddha. But up until the mid-19th century, most scholars were actually in doubt about the relation between Brahmanism, for example, and Buddhism. For a long time, these two were seen maybe to be a part of the same tradition. Maybe they didn't actually for sure know that Buddhism was its own particular tradition, and also a lot of debates about the antiquity of Buddhism in contrast to Brahmanism. Which of these two, if they are separate, is the oldest? Is Brahmanism older than Buddhism, or is Buddhism the oldest? So that's something that's often forgotten in the reception of Buddhism, that scholars were actually not certain about these things. They kept discussing it. Something we see in the works of Blavatsky as well, when she speaks about a pre-Vedic Buddhism, a pre-Brahmanic Buddhism and so forth. That's actually a part of a larger discussion among scholars. It's not something unique to Blavatsky. Also, as scholarship emerged and continued in relation to Buddhism, it came into the awareness of many in the West that there are so many similarities between Buddhism and Christianity. That is this a coincidence, or what is it? And people were a little bit afraid of this. A lot of, including the great scholar of religions Max Müller, he argued that yes, there is no religion besides Buddhism that reminds us so much of Christianity, but Buddhism, on the other hand, is really dangerous because there's no religion that brings us further away from the truth. Moina Williams, the great Sanskrit expert, also at Oxford, had the same notion that there are many similarities, but Buddhism is also dangerous, and we should be careful because Christianity, of course, is superior. So these scholars also operated within this framework of Christianity, basically, and judged Buddhism based on that framework at the time. Something that was quite in contrast to Blavatsky when she came on the scene, because the almost entire volume of Isis Unveiled, the second volume of Isis Unveiled, is very much a comparison between also Christianity and Buddhism, like other scholars had done. But she flipped the picture around and said that Buddhism was the superior and Christianity was a later degradation of Buddhism. So there was discussions about this at the time. It was not really until Bourneuf's introduction to the history of Buddhism in India at around the mid-19th century, 1848 or 44, that marked a major shift. That's where, okay, now we know that Buddhism is something in itself, apart from Brahmanism, and we also can reconstruct the basic doctrines of Buddhism at the time. So, a little bit later, in 1883, A.P. Sinnett emerges on the scene and publishes a book entitled Esoteric Buddhism, as I know most of you know. And what was the meaning of this? As I mentioned, the great public was interested in Buddhism. They really want to consume information about Buddhism, and suddenly a book emerges on the scene in London saying that now I will tell you about many of the elements of Buddhism that has been kept secret and withheld, but now it's laid out. And it became a kind of bestseller in a way. Many Orientalists and scholars were not really happy about that because they thought it was a basic distortion of Buddhism, but it became a bestseller in many respects. Became very popular, saw many editions at the time. So what did Sinnett mean by an esoteric Buddhism? He states that, in a way, esoteric Buddhism, it doesn't really refer to specifically to a tradition within Buddhism. It's a universal concept. Esoteric Buddhism is the same doctrine that is identical in all religions around the world. It's not specifically related to Buddhism as such. But he does emphasize the importance of Buddhism because he says that even though the esoteric core in all world religions are the same, the exoteric Buddhism has remained in closer union with the esoteric doctrine than any other popular religion. So there is, of course, an exoteric tradition, the one we can find in texts and traditions around Asia, and that's not the same as esoteric Buddhism, but still this Buddhistic tradition has remained in closer union. It hasn't been as corrupted as the exoteric aspects of many other world religions. So he still emphasizes the importance of Buddhism. And of course, the book, as I mentioned, gave off the impression that this is Buddhism, even though actually it says that it's not really Buddhism, it's the esoteric core. That's of course a part of what we could call Theosophical Orientalism, that most of the Asian religions are read into a pre-established frame of esotericism. So they set out to find this esotericism in the Asian traditions. But also, actually, Blavatsky had already spoken about an esoteric Buddhism before Sinnett. So it's not something that emerged with Sinnett. So we could also take a look at Isis Unveiled, for example, and see what Blavatsky said about this concept of an esoteric Buddhism, what they meant about it. You can see that in the next quote here, Blavatsky writes in Isis Unveiled, when we use the term Buddhist, we do not mean to imply by it either the exoteric Buddhism instituted by the followers of Gautama Buddha, nor the modern Buddhistic religion, but the secret philosophy of Sakyamuni, which is in essence certainly identical with the ancient wisdom religion of the sanctuary, the so-called pre-Vedic Brahmanism. So Blavatsky also points to this notion that it's not the Buddhism we see in texts and traditions, it's something that is more secret, withheld. So it's not identical to the Buddhist tradition, it's more universal than that. But why did she speak about this pre-Vedic Buddhism, this older Buddhism? First off, you can see here as well that by Buddhism, therefore, we mean that religion signifying literally the doctrine of wisdom, and which by many ages antedates the metaphysical philosophy of Siddhartha Sakyamuni. So the real esoteric Buddhism is not something that the historical Buddha invented or produced for the first time. He was just an exponent of a longer tradition. So that's the kind of conception of Buddhism, or esoteric Buddhism, that was a part of the early philosophies, that it was a universal doctrine, and the exoteric religion was just an expression of that. So, where did Blavatsky get these ideas from, that there was a Buddhism that was even older than Sakyamuni, and also that it was an esoteric universal religion? Of course, that had been a part of discussions among scholars in the early 19th century already, but especially two books, one by Godfrey Higgins, the very comprehensive work, Anacalypsis, which was an attempt to discover the relations between languages and nations and religions around the world at an early date, late 1820s, and Hargrave Jennings in his Indian Religion from 1858. Let's see what they write. And we know that Blavatsky read these works. She refers to them. She writes in her letters, as we can see in the first volume of her letters that has been published in 2003, that she really consumed Higgins' work. And you can see that Higgins, as a part of the debates in the early 19th century, writes the following about Buddhism. When the first religious war, probably that of the Mahabharata, arose, then ended the Golden Age. That's because Higgins tried to establish the history of religions based on astrological cycles. So there would be changes in the religious landscape depending on which astrological cycle that was influencing the world, so to speak. But when the Golden Age ended with the Great War, the age of the universal religion, the universal prevalence of Buddhism is a fact, not a theory. I think I may also say the same of the wars of the Mahabharata and the origin of sex. Everywhere, as we advance in time, the remains of a decayed system in endless variety display themselves and support the truth of the tradition of the story of the Golden Age, the universal tradition of all ancient and profane history. Everywhere we find the original system, and everywhere signs of its decay. This system was the secret universal system, that of Buddha, and it was this ancient original Indian religion from which later systems arose. So already in the early 19th century, Godfrey Higgins proposed that there was a universal religion that was a part of the Golden Age, so to speak, and there was a great war, and this universal system came dispersed around the world, and that this original system was actually Buddhism, the secret system of Buddhism. And obviously Blavatsky agreed with this and found this to be something she also thought. So we find this repeated in Hargrave Jennings a little bit later, in 58, as I mentioned. Buddhism, which with its truths underlies all religious beliefs of the East, and which, though free of all the ceremonial, undoubtedly was the origin of the modern Brahmanical religion, and that Brahmanism may be considered to be the starred and decorated and human-marked child of its inexpressibly, sublimely descended parent Buddhism. So there was this notion that Buddhism was the oldest and the universal system, which Blavatsky also adopted, and which, of course, became the notion of an esoteric Buddhism. Also, if we look at the debates among the Orientalists, I'll go into that in a few minutes. We see that the Orientalists, they preferred the Southern Buddhism, the Pali Buddhism, and Blavatsky and Sinnett always preferred the so-called Northern Buddhism, especially in Tibet, Himalayan. But why? We see that Blavatsky writes here in Isis Unveiled that both in Western and Eastern Tibet, as in every other place where Buddhism predominates, there are two distinct religions, the same as it is in Brahmanism: the secret philosophy and the popular religion. The Buddhism of Nepal being the one which may be said to have diverged less than any other from the primeval ancient faith, the Lamanism of Tartary, Mongolia and Tibet, which is a direct offshoot of this country, may be thus shown to be the purest form of Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism is the purest form, the one that throughout history has corrupted the less, or the core secret teachings have been maintained. Higgins already wrote a long time before that, no person has turned his mind to the consideration of the religion of Tibet, which is the only country in which we have the Buddhist religion in anything like its original purity. So he already pointed to the notion that Tibet would be the place of, where Buddhism had been kept pure. And Jennings repeated that a little bit later. Buddhism still subsists in all its purity in Nepal as well as in Tibet. So it was a part of a kind of reception of Buddhism that the Northern Buddhism would be the most pure form of Buddhism. But this was the complete opposite picture of the Orientalists, the scholars of Buddhism, especially it's a narrative that flows through all the scholars of Buddhism, as we will see, but especially Thomas Rice Davis and his wife Caroline Rice Davis, when they established the Pali Text Society in 1881, which really became a focus center for the study of the earliest form of Buddhism, which would also be the purest form of Buddhism, the Southern Buddhism in the Pali scriptures. And they didn't really have any great regard for Mahayana Buddhism because that was a later corruption. So already in relation to this, we see that there is a controversy. Also, we know from the works of Blavatsky, the Secret Doctrine and so forth, that the Buddhism that is presented there is very much Mahayana. We are talking about Bodhisattvas and the Nirmanakayas and Vajrayana Buddhism, which had no real importance among the Orientalists. In the Secret Doctrine, for example, we see that Blavatsky constantly points to the Trans-Himalayan region and the Trans-Himalayan wisdom. I worked a bit on this in my thesis, which Jim mentioned, that actually Blavatsky argued that what she was expounding in the Secret Doctrine was the Trans-Himalayan wisdom. It was not identical with Theosophy in the sense that Theosophy is completely universal. But this is a particular tradition, but it's the most pure secret tradition in the Trans-Himalayan regions. And of course she claimed access to the Book of Diane and these texts, and the Secret Doctrine is very much a commentary on this tradition. So it has this Tibetan focus. And as I mentioned, because the Secret Doctrine has this Tibetan focus, and because Blavatsky already, when she came to New York, said to interviewers and so reporters, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, and that they Alcott and Blavatsky took official initiation in Sri Lanka, becoming Buddhists, and Alcott worked a lot for the revival of Buddhism and so forth. So Theosophy became very associated with Buddhism, but she also tried to keep it universal and not to promote one religion. So you can see that in her writings, that there is this constant attempt to balance out her own focus on Tibet and Buddhism, and then at the same time Theosophy as something universal. And some of the material published in the third volume of the Secret Doctrine, which also can be found in the collected writings, you see that she promotes the idea of an esoteric Buddhism, and that is something different from the Southern Buddhism. For while the Southern Buddhists have no idea of the existence of an esoteric doctrine enshrined like a pearl within the shell of every religion, the Chinese and the Tibetans have preserved numerous records of the fact. Degenerate, fallen as is now the doctrine publicly preached by Gautama, it is yet preserved in the monasteries in China that are placed beyond the reach of visitors. And she tells about the Trans-Himalayan, and that there is this distinction in Buddhism between the heart seal and the eye doctrine. Of course, the eye doctrine is the exoteric, which you can see with your eyes and so forth, but the heart doctrine is what has to be lived, the lived Buddhism. And actually she takes this from a scholar I'll present in a moment, but she turns it around because he prefers Southern Buddhism and finds the later Buddhism as a corrupt, but Blavatsky found that the Southern Buddhism was the exoteric Buddhism. So again, this distinction between Pali Buddhism and Northern Buddhism. Let's take a look at what some of the Orientalist scholars of Buddhism said at the time. There were quite a number of scholars working on Buddhism. We have Emile Louis Bourneuf, who was part of a family of distinguished professors in the study of ancient religions and Sanskrit in this case, and he wrote Le Bouddhisme en Occident, that he actually liked the Theosophical Society because they were in a way a modern society similar to what Buddhism originally had been, a reformative attempt to bring back enlightenment and knowledge in a time of crisis. So he actually liked the philosophical effort and could identify with it. So he was not that critical. And Blavatsky later on was very happy that a distinguished professor like him would speak positive about the Theosophical Society. But she also criticized him because he argued, like everybody else, that there doesn't exist such a thing as an esoteric Buddhism. That was the one point he didn't agree on with the Theosophists. We have Joseph Athens, who was the one I mentioned that Blavatsky derived much of her material from, because he wrote on Chinese Buddhism in 1880, which became a very used source for Blavatsky in her reception of Mahayana doctrines. So even though Athens, who spent a long time in China, 50 years I believe, he didn't really see Chinese Buddhism as the highest form of Buddhism. Blavatsky found this to be more pure in many ways. He writes that, yet it does not appear that there was any secret doctrine which those who knew it would not divulge. What they held was simply a protest against the neglect of the heart and dependence on book knowledge and the performance of outward rites. He continues by stating that the doctrines were therefore given orally and that they have been collected in the so-called records of the sayings. So he, of course, because he studied Chinese Buddhism, knew that many of the texts claimed to be esoteric, but he didn't really regard it as an esoteric doctrine. It was just something they said as kind of a protest. We also have Moine Williams, colleague and competitor with Max Müller. He wrote his Buddhism in its connection with Brahmanism and Hinduism and its contrast with Christianity in 1889. And he was, of course, also familiar with notions about esoteric Buddhism, but disregarded them. He writes, we learn from Mr. Sarat Chandra Das, who was one who composed a dictionary of Tibetan at the time, that in the monastery of Galdan in Tibet there is at this moment a college specifically devoted to the teachings of esoteric and mystical Buddhism, and reasons. Of course, it was only natural that with the association of Buddhism with the later yoga and Saivanism, the Buddha himself should have become a center for the growth of supernatural and mystical ideas. I.e., he reasoned that this sort of esoteric Buddhism is a later form of Buddhism and not really a pure form of Buddhism. Furthermore, originally Buddhism set its face against all solidarity, asceticism, and all secret efforts to attain sublime heights of knowledge. It had no occult, no esoteric system of doctrine which is withheld from ordinary men. So there's no esoteric Buddhism as such. So even though he knows that Mahayana texts speak about an esoteric Buddhism, it's not really true Buddhism. But he was still also sympathetic to, especially Alcott. He liked Alcott's work for reviving Buddhism, and he also found that, well, even though he spent like 30 pages criticizing esoteric Buddhism, he still, at the end, attempts to show that, okay, maybe this is of interest still. So he writes that the subject of mystical Buddhism ought not to be brushed aside as unworthy of consideration. It furnishes, in my opinion, a highly interesting topic of inquiry, especially in its bearing in the Neo-Buddhism and Theosophy of the present day. So there was still a little opening that this might be something of interest, but he was one of the only scholars at the time who had this view of Theosophy. We also have a little bit later Lawrence Waddell, who wrote about Tibetan Buddhism, was really a breakthrough work at the time in terms of the study of Tibetan Buddhism. Not many scholars of Tibetan Buddhism today would take any of his study serious or agree with it anymore. But you can see the attitude here towards Tibetan Buddhism at the time, and this was a scholar who spent his whole life studying this. with its adoption of Tantrism, so-called Buddhism, not really Buddhism, but so-called Buddhism, entered on its most degenerate phase. Here, the idolatrous cult of female energies was grafted upon the theistic Mahayana and the pantheistic mysticism of yoga. And this parasite seized stronghold of its host and soon developed its monstrous growths, which crushed and strangled most of the little life yet remaining of the purely Buddhistic stock. So you can see that when we come to Tibet and the later developments, Buddhism is really a parasite that has corrupted true Buddhism, which of course is the early Pali Buddhism. And furthermore, it is with this essentially un-Buddhistic school of pantheistic mysticism, which with its charlatanism contributed to the decline of Buddhism in India, that the so-called Theosophists claim kinship. If so-called Esoteric Buddhism would better be termed exoteric, for it is foreign to the principles of the Buddha. But already here I hope you can begin to perceive the idea that one of the reasons why Orientalist scholars criticized Theosophy and Esoteric Buddhism was also because they were criticizing Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism as later corruptions. So of course the Theosophists took up that kind of Buddhism, which they saw as something that was not really pure Buddhism, charlatanism. So in a way, Theosophy and the Theosophical reception of Buddhism became bracketed with the later corruptions of Buddhism. It was the same in a way. Mervyn Marie Snell was one who dug a little bit deeper than the other scholars into the connection between Buddhism and Theosophy, and he actually found that there is something to it, even though Theosophy has Hinduized Buddhism, there's still some connection. To Snell, like others, it was unquestionable that Theosophy was an unequivocal contrast to the Buddhism of the Sutta Pitaka. Quote, but when we leave the so-called Hinayana Buddhism and look to Tibet and Japan and present the two greatest strongholds of the Buddhist religion, and to Nepal, the original home of the Mahayana, the case is altered. So in his study of Blavatsky and Theosophy, he can see that there is a connection between Mahayana and Theosophy. So he thought that the picture should be changed a little bit. So another picture that emerges here is that you can see that because Theosophy had such a prominence in talking about Buddhism in the 19th century, nearly all scholars at the time had to discuss Theosophy. They all took Theosophy into consideration and considered what the Theosophists said and had to respond to it. They felt it was necessary to respond because they wanted to also control the picture of how Buddhism was presented and what it was about, and they didn't agree with the Theosophists. But looking back now, historically speaking, we can see that, as my argument is, there are two different receptions of Buddhism, and one was disregarded by the Orientalists. You can see Max Muller here writing that who has not suffered lately from Theosophy and Esoteric Buddhism. It's really something he's quite heard about, that this is getting out there. Journals are full of it. Novels overflow with it, and the private and confidential letters to ask what it all really means. Esoteric Buddhism has no sweet odor in the nostrils of Sanskrit and Pali scholars. They try to keep aloof of it. So he was not pleased with Theosophy at all, and a whole debate began in the magazine, the 19th century, and here. After Blavatsky's death, he didn't really want to confront Blavatsky, so he...
But your 19th century...
was it 1992, I think, just out of three, maybe, just after Blavatsky's death. But in this debate he begins in the 19th century, well, maybe he didn't intend it to be a debate, but Sinnett responded, and he was not happy about that either. But you could also see how he really was prejudiced in many ways, also towards women. He called Blavatsky a clever, wild, and excitable girl. So something that wouldn't really fit well with the political landscape today, I think, about gender politics and so forth. He goes on and says that sometimes people just want to be fooled and being misled and as you can see in the last quote here, she was deceived by persons who saw that she almost wished to be deceived and that she had no means whatever of defending herself against deceit. So she was just an excitable girl who could not defend herself and didn't know much, because as she also writes here, only really Pali and Sanskrit scholars can study and understand Buddhism. And of course the Theosophists, they go and talk to the Buddhists where we should focus on the texts and that we have collected and are in the libraries. We shouldn't go and talk to the Buddhists, also because modern Buddhists are corrupt forms of Buddhism, not the original Buddhism that we can find in the texts. So what the Theosophists learned from living Buddhists or Mahatmas or Masters, that's something that must be later corruptions. And you can see here also about the notion of esoteric Buddhism. He writes that if there is any religion entirely free from esoteric doctrine, it is Buddhism. There never was any such thing as mystery in Buddhism, and whatever of the esoteric teaching there may have been in other religions, there was none in the religion of Buddha. Whatever was esoteric or secret was ipso facto not Buddha's teaching. So there's this distinction, and the reason for that, as I mentioned, is because all talk about esoteric Buddhism was later Buddhism, and so that was not really Buddhism in the minds of these scholars. Later on, however, he must admit again as a scholar and historian that there are certain forms of Buddhism that argue for an esoteric Buddhism. Not mean to say that Buddhism has never been corrupted and vulgarized when it became the religion of barbarous or semi-barbarous people in Tibet, China and Mongolia. So, nor should I wish to deny that it has in some places been represented by knaves and impostors as something mysterious, esoteric, impenetrable and unintelligible. It is true also that particularly in so-called Mahayana Buddhism, there are certain treatises which are called secret, but they are secret not as being withheld from anybody, but simply as containing more difficult and recondite doctrines. But this, in a way, it contradicts what he just said, that there is no such thing as esotericism in Buddhism. Here, a few pages later on, he recognizes, but it's because it's Mahayana Buddhism, which is not real Buddhism. We find the same notion with Rice Davis, who also speaks about Tibetan Buddhism as the latest phase of the corruption of Buddhism. And he also writes about Sinet's esoteric Buddhism. If there's anything that can be said absolute certainty about the book, it is that it is not esoteric and it is not Buddhism. And he continues, like other Orientalists, to argue that the original Buddhism was the very contrary to esoteric. So it's the same narrative that is being constructed and repeated by almost all scholars of Buddhism at the time, that we should focus on early Pali Buddhism. Mahayana is a corruption, Tibet is filled with barbarous people, and what Blavatsky and Sinet talk about is also not Buddhism. And much later he was interviewed as a part of the Mahabodhi Society, and he was asked about the Theosophists in 1914. Of course, I'm aware of the pretensions put forward by the adherents of what is called Theosophy, but to the student they are of no importance whatever. The exponents of that creed are lamentably ignorant of the literatures of the East. They know nothing of Pali, and they talk, for instance, about esoteric teaching, though there is no esoteric teaching whatever in Buddhism. Their ideas are based on the beliefs of the medieval alchemists, which they mix up with a little misunderstood Indian thought. So, but the interesting thing is that scholars of Buddhism today, and also especially of Tibetan Buddhism, all agree that Tibetan Buddhism is not the last corrupted form of Buddhism. It's an authentic tradition, and in some regards Tibetan texts are used because either we don't have the Sanskrit or because they have remained in the pure forms of translation in translation studies. And most scholars agree today that, of course, there are esoteric forms of Buddhism in Japan, China, Tibet, and so forth. So the view has completely changed since this time. And just an interesting small side story is that Caroline Rice Davis, who was wife to Thomas Rice Davis and a prominent scholar of Pali in her own right, after her husband died in 1921, I think, she actually began to, even though she had worked with the Pali Sanskrit, Pali Text Center for years, and put forth articles about the Anatma doctrine and the no soul doctrine, she changed her views and became associated with the Theosophical circles after he died. So that's something that also has been forgotten to history. And there was, of course, a whole reception of Buddhism in the West in the 20th century, which I won't go into, but Buddhism was really promoted by theosophists in 20th century. So let's just, I'll just read some points of conclusion, and we can end. So this paper has contextually analyzed the origin and meaning of the notion of an esoteric Buddhism, as Blavatsky in his works, the notion of an esoteric Buddhism, and the interconnected notion of it being ancient and universal was already prevalent in Higgins and Jennings' works. Therefrom, it presumed was picked up and elaborated on in Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. The same is the case with the idea that Buddhism has remained most original and pure in northern or Himalayan regions such as Tibet and Nepal. Most Oriental scholars in the second half of the 19th century, however, took another view favoring the southern Pali scriptures, which they regarded as the original form of Buddhism, and all later forms as unoriginal distortions, the Tibetan being the worst. Blavatsky and Sidis' works and the idea of an esoteric Buddhism, however, became so influential that many of the most prominent Oriental scholars naturally discussed them, something that has been more or less forgotten, except for Max Muller maybe. This includes, as we have seen, Bourneuf, Atkins, Weiner Williams, Müller, Snell, Waddell, and Davis. While some of these scholars regarded theosophy more positively and others more negatively, they all seem to agree unanimously that there is no such thing as an esoteric Buddhism. They were, as such, not unaware of esoteric elements in the Buddhist scriptures, but these were regarded as corrupted. They did not count them as a part of the true nature of Buddhism as found in the Pali scriptures. The Theosophists, on the other hand, based on their Mahayana-oriented interpretation of Buddhism, maintained that Buddhism, as it was known at the time, primarily represents the exoteric aspect of Gautama Buddha's teachings. Buddha had himself been initiated and had an esoteric set of teachings which have been handed down through history and can be learned from initiates in the East or revealed by the correct symbolical keys of interpretation, as the text contain many blinds. And this is not really just a philosophical view, it's basically a Mahayana view. In the end, as this paper has shown, we are dealing with the reception, I would argue, of a plurality of Buddhist traditions that especially were condensed in two primary yet entangled receptions of Buddhism in the 19th century, academic and Theosophical Orientalism. Each of these two highlighted and constructed or construed different aspects of Buddhism to fit their own views, such as that of a pure historical Protestant reformer or that of universal esotericism, and both became entangled in debates that continue to impact the reception of Buddhism today. In the end, as this paper has shown, we are dealing with the reception of a plurality of Buddhist traditions that especially were condensed in two primary yet entangled receptions of Buddhism. That's what I just said. I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you very much.